This story was sent to me by a listener who identifies himself as Andres, an on-call doctor in a public hospital in a medium-sized city. He wrote to me that he is not someone who believes in supernatural things, that his training and work have taught him to seek rational explanations for everything, and that precisely because of this, what he experienced during a night shift 2 years ago disturbed him in a way that he still hasn't fully resolved. If you have an experience you've kept to yourself that you never knew how to tell, write to me. Sometimes the right place for certain stories is not everyday conversation, but a space like this, where no one will judge you. Now, allow me to tell you what happened to Andres on the hospital ward during the 3 o'clock shift with a patient who hadn't spoken for 3 weeks. I have been working in emergency and hospitalization for 12 years. I have seen people die. I have seen individuals in the most extreme moments of their lives, with fear on their faces and their bodies failing, and their consciousness clinging to whatever it can. I have learned to process that in the way doctors do, with a functional distance that is not coldness but professional survival, the ability to compartmentalize what you see in order to remain useful. I share this to make it clear from the beginning that I am not someone who is easily frightened. I am not someone who interprets the creaks of an old building as something supernatural, nor do I see meaning in coincidences. I am, or was, a deeply skeptical person about everything that lacks verifiable explanation. What happened that night on the 4th floor has no verifiable explanation, and I have spent 2 years trying to find it. The hospital where I work has 5 floors for hospitalization and emergency services on the ground floor. The 4th floor is for internal medicine, where cases that require prolonged observation but are not in critical condition are admitted. It is a quiet floor compared to the emergency room or the ICU. The patients are usually elderly people with decompensated chronic conditions who stay there for days or weeks while they stabilize. On that floor, there was a patient who had been admitted for 3 weeks when what I am about to recount happened. His name was Mr. Aurelio. He was 84 years old, and he had been admitted for pneumonia that had evolved complicatedly in a man of his age and with his medical history. Physically, he was responding to treatment. The markers were improving week by week, and everything indicated that in a couple of weeks he could be discharged. The problem was that Mr. Aurelio did not speak, not because he couldn't. His vocal cords were functioning, his airways were clear, his level of consciousness was adequate. He simply did not speak. He looked at those who entered his room with complete and quiet attention, responded to basic instructions, allowed himself to be examined without resistance, but did not utter a single word. Psychiatry had evaluated him, the neurologist had too. There was no identifiable injury, no diagnosable dementia. The provisional conclusion was reactive mutism, likely related to the stress of prolonged hospitalization in an elderly person. His family, a daughter and a son-in-law who came to visit him every afternoon, said that he had always been a man of few words, but that this was different. That since he was admitted, there was something in him that they did not recognize. That sometimes when they arrived for a visit, they found him staring at the corner of the room, the corner that was in front of his bed, with a fixation that made them uncomfortable. I had attended to Mr. Aurelio during several shifts. He was an easy patient in a practical sense. He didn't cause problems, and he didn't need much active attention beyond routine monitoring. But there was something about him that also made me uncomfortable, although I had never analyzed it too much until that night. It was the way he looked at that corner. The Wednesday shift started normally. I received the afternoon report, reviewed the patients who needed priority attention, and made rounds on the floors. Mr. Aurelio was stable. He ate what was served to him, which was already an improvement from previous weeks. When I entered his room around 10 o'clock at night for the night check, he looked at me with his calm and still attention. The corner in front of his bed was empty, as always, but he wasn't looking at it that night. He was looking at me. I noted his vital signs, asked him if he was in pain, received silence as the usual response, and left. At 1 in the morning, I received a call from the 4th floor. The on-duty nurse named Pilar, who had been at that hospital longer than I had, called me with a voice that was not of medical urgency but of something else that I couldn't classify immediately. "Dr. Andres, can you come to room 42? Room 42 was Don Aurelio's room. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Has he gotten worse?" "No," Pilar said. "He is talking." It took me a second to process that. "He is talking?" "Yes. A brief pause. Please come. I went up to the fourth floor. The hallway was in that specific calm of hospitals in the early morning. The lighting dimmed. The distant sound of some monitor. The smell of disinfectant that one stops noticing after years. But that night I perceived with a strange clarity. Pilar was waiting for me outside room 42. She was a woman in her 50s, with that accumulated experience of someone who has seen practically everything in a hospital and is no longer easily unsettled. But that night she had an expression I had never seen before. "How long has he been talking?" I asked quietly. "For about 20 minutes, Pilar said, also quietly. It caught my attention because I heard the voice from the hallway and thought someone had come in to visit him, that it was a voice I didn't recognize. I went in, and he was alone. "What is he saying?" Pilar looked at me. "That's what I want you to hear," she said. I gently pushed the door and entered. The room was dimly lit, with only the soft light from the bedside lamp on. Don Aurelio was sitting up in bed, his eyes open, staring directly at the corner across the room, that corner his family had mentioned. And he was speaking. It was a low, continuous voice, with the rhythm of someone having a conversation. Not a monologue. A conversation, with pauses between phrases, as if he were listening to responses that I couldn't hear. The voice was calm, without agitation, without signs of distress. But there was something in it that made the hairs on my arms stand on end before my brain processed why. It was not Don Aurelio's voice. Oh, it wasn't exactly his voice. It was deeper. It had a different cadence, something older in tone, as if the words were coming from a place deeper than the throat. I attributed it in that first moment to the illness, to the effects of weeks of previous intubation, to any medical explanation that could accommodate what I was hearing. I approached. I stood next to his bed. Don Aurelio did not look at me. His eyes remained fixed on the corner. I listened to what he was saying. Most of it was difficult to understand, words in a low voice overlapping each other. But I caught fragments, and what I caught stuck with me with a precision that still feels strange, because at that moment I was not in a position to take notes, but the words settled in my memory with a clarity that did not correspond to the circumstances. He said, "I know it's time." And then, after a pause, "Not yet." And then, "There is someone who shouldn't hear this." At that moment, his eyes moved from the corner to me. He looked directly at me, with that still and complete attention of his. And for the first time in 3 weeks of guard duty, Don Aurelio spoke to me. "Doctor," he said with that voice that was not quite his voice, "do you believe in what cannot be seen?" It took me a second to respond. "I am a doctor. I am trained to maintain composure in stressful situations." "Don Aurelio," I said with my voice as calm as I could, "I'm glad you are speaking. How do you feel? You?" He did not answer my question. He kept looking at me. "There are things that stay in places," he said, "like the smell of tobacco in a room where someone smoked for years. You can't see it, but it's there. Do you understand?" "I understand what you're telling me," I said. "No," he said. And in that denial there was something that was not correction, but something more like the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are talking about. "You understand the words, not what is behind the words." He leaned back against the pillow again. His eyes returned to the corner, and the conversation that I could not hear continued. I left the room. Pilar was in the hallway. "Had anything like this ever happened before?" I asked her. She took a moment. "In that room," she said, "about 7 years ago a patient died who had been admitted for several weeks. He was also an older man. He also spent the last week talking to something that no one else could see or hear." She paused. "Back then, I thought it was the medication, or the terminal state, or just what happens to people when they are very close to the end. And now?" I said. Pilar looked at me with that expression of hers that was not exactly fear, but something more reflective. "Now I think that maybe there are things that happen in certain places and that certain people can perceive and others cannot," she said, "and that Don Aurelio is one of those who can." I returned to the room 3 more times that night. On each occasion, Don Aurelio was in the same position, with his eyes in the corner, speaking in a low voice. On the second visit, his vital signs were perfectly normal. On the third, around 4 in the morning, he fell silent, closed his eyes, and fell asleep with the placidity of someone who has finished a long and satisfying conversation. I stood at the door of his room for a moment, looking at that empty corner to which he had dedicated so many hours of attention, and tried to feel something, anything, any variation in temperature or air pressure, or any measurable parameter that would give me a rational anchor to what I had witnessed. I felt nothing. The corner was just a corner. White walls, linoleum floor, the leg of a visitor's chair. With nothing visible, no anomalies detected, nothing that my medical training or common sense could point to as the source of what had happened that night. I closed the door and went to write the shift notes. The next morning, when day shift arrived, I informed the attending physician about Mr. Aurelio that the patient had spoken during the night. She noted it with clinical interest, went to see him, and called me a little while later with something in her voice that was not exactly surprise, but something more akin to controlled perplexity. Mr. Aurelio had spoken to her. Not much, not extensively, but he had answered her questions briefly and clearly. He had told her that he felt well. He had asked her when he could go home. The physician interpreted it as a spontaneous resolution of the mutism, which was not unusual in these types of cases. She called psychiatry for a re-evaluation. She called the family to inform them of the change. Everyone was happy. I should have been too. The patient was improving. It was the expected outcome. But that afternoon, before going home to sleep after my shift, I went up to the 4th floor once more. The door to room 42 was open. Don Aurelio was sitting on the bed, looking out the window, with the afternoon light coming in at an angle. His daughter had come to visit and was sitting beside him, holding his hand, with that expression of relief of someone who has regained something they feared they had lost. I peeked into the doorway. Don Aurelio saw me, and he said something I didn't expect. "Doctor." His voice was now more recognizable, more his own, with that raspy tone of men his age who have smoked for a long time. "Thank you for staying last night." "It's my job," I said. He shook his head very slowly. "Not for that," he said. "For not leaving when you should have." A pause. "There are things that are better if someone is present. Someone who is not afraid." His daughter was looking at us, not entirely understanding the exchange. I didn't fully understand it either, but I nodded. And Don Aurelio looked out the window again. She was discharged 2 weeks later. She walked out, with her daughter on one side and her son-in-law on the other, with that quiet dignity of the elderly who have decided that what time they have left will be lived on their own terms. As she passed by the nursing station, she saw me and stopped for a moment. "Take care," she told me simply, and she left. Pilar and I looked at each other when she disappeared down the hallway toward the elevators. "Did she ever ask you who she was talking to?" Pilar asked me. "Not directly," I said. "I did," she said. "The morning after that night, I asked her, just like that, who she had been talking to." She paused. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Someone who needed to be heard, and who had been waiting a long time for someone to do it." I processed that in silence. "And what do you think?" I asked her. Pilar picked up some papers from the control desk and organized them with that efficiency of hers, as someone who always has something to do. "I think," he said, "that there are people who can do things that others cannot, that there are places where those things are easier, and that sometimes what seems like an illness is something completely different." He looked at me, and I think that room is now quieter than before Don Aurelio arrived, and that whatever it means seems good to me. 2 years have passed since that night. I have continued working in the same hospital, on the same 4th floor, and I have entered room 42 hundreds of times since then. It is a room like the others, with its white walls and linoleum floor and its window overlooking the parking lot. The corner in front of the bed is just a corner, but there is something that changed in me that night and has not returned to its previous state, and it is the way I listen to patients who speak of things I cannot see. It's not that I now blindly believe in the supernatural. I am still a doctor. I still look for medical explanations first. I still apply the protocol. But there is something in my attitude that opened a millimeter that night and has not completely closed. A willingness to consider that perhaps not everything that happens in hospital rooms at dawn has an explanation that fits in a medical manual. And sometimes, when I do the night round and pass by 42 with the door ajar and the room in shadow, I pause for a moment in the hallway, listening, The silence inside is different from that of the other rooms. I don't know if that means anything, but I no longer ignore it. And that's all Andres told me. This is the testimony of Andres. He wrote to me at the end that Don Aurelio passed away a few months after being discharged at home, surrounded by his family, calmly according to what his daughter told him in a message she sent to inform him. I thought it was important to include that. There is something in this story that has to do with listening, with what happens when someone finally pays attention to what others cannot or do not want to see. If you work in a hospital or anywhere you are close to people in critical moments and have experienced something you didn't know how to explain, I would like to know. Leave it in the comments. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. There are more stories like this waiting. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. A follower who works as a night watchman in a municipal cemetery sent me this experience a few days ago. His name is Roberto, and what he experienced during his rounds made him question everything he believed about death. If you work at night in lonely places and have seen things you can't explain, I would love for you to share below. Now let me tell you what Roberto discovered on the darkest nights among the graves. My name is Roberto and I work as a night watchman at the San Miguel Municipal Cemetery on the outskirts of Montevideo, Uruguay. I have been in this job for 12 years, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had seen it all. Drunks sneaking into sleep among the graves, teenagers playing pranks, occasional acts of vandalism. Nothing I couldn't handle with a call to the police. But what began to happen last March completely changed my perspective on what I really watch over each night. San Miguel Cemetery is one of the oldest in the city. It was founded in 1835, and some of its graves are historical monuments. It covers approximately 10 hectares, with marble mausoleums, family crypts, and more modest sections where ordinary people rest. During the day, it is a quiet place where families visit their deceased. But at night, when the gates close and only I remain with my flashlight, the cemetery transforms into something completely different. I work the shift from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. My routine is simple. I make rounds every hour, check that the gates are closed, that there are no intruders, that branches haven't fallen on the graves. Between rounds, I sit in the watchtower at the main entrance, where I have a small television, a coffee maker, and a heater for the cold winters. I have seen strange things over the years. Lights that seem to move among the graves but disappear when I get closer. Sounds that I can't fully explain. Whispers when there is no wind. Footsteps on gravel when I am alone. But I always found ways to rationalize it. The lights were reflections of cars on the nearby street. The sounds were nocturnal animals or the settling of old structures. Until the night of March 15th. It was a Friday, and it had been raining all afternoon. The air was cool and damp, with that low mist that makes everything look blurry and distant. I started my shift as usual, checking the perimeter, making sure all the side doors were locked. Around midnight, during my third round, I noticed something unusual. In the oldest section of the cemetery, where the 19th century graves are, there was a light. It wasn't the kind of light I had seen before, a fleeting reflection I could attribute to car headlights. This was constant, soft, like the light of a candle, emanating from one of the largest mausoleums. I approached, with my flashlight held high. The mausoleum belonged to the Ortega family, one of the founding families of Montevideo. It was an imposing structure of white marble with columns and a wrought iron door, and that door, which had always been locked with a rusty padlock, was ajar. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, expecting to find vandals or vagrants. There was no response. The light continued to flicker softly from within. I pushed the door, which opened with a prolonged creak. Inside, the mausoleum was larger than I expected. It could hold maybe 20 coffins, arranged in niches in the walls. And in the center of the space, on the marble floor, there were 3 lit black candles, forming a perfect triangle. In the center of the triangle, there were symbols drawn with something that looked like ash or charcoal. They were not random scribbles. They were deliberate, precise, and although I had no idea what they meant, they made me feel deeply uncomfortable. Someone had been here. Someone had performed some kind of ritual. I carefully extinguished the candles, swept the symbols with my boot, and closed the mausoleum, making sure the lock was firmly in place this time. I reported the incident in my night log. Possible vandal activity at the Ortega Mausoleum. Strange symbols found. Area secured. I thought that would be the end of the matter, but I was wrong. 2 nights later, a Sunday, I found the same mausoleum open again. And once again, the 3 black candles, the triangle, the symbols on the ground. But this time there was something else. A small doll, made of dry branches tied with red string, placed in the exact center of the triangle. A chill ran down my spine. This was not the work of bored teenagers. It was something more deliberate, more serious. Someone was using the cemetery to practice some kind of witchcraft or dark ritual. I called the police. 2 officers arrived an hour later, inspected the mausoleum, took photographs, and confiscated the doll as evidence. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but we both knew that with the department's limited resources, that meant maybe 1 additional visit per week. "Do you have any idea who could be doing this?" one of the officers asked me. "I haven't seen anyone. I make rounds every hour. I don't know how they get in without me seeing them." The officers left, and I continued my shift, but I could no longer relax. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every sound put me on alert. Over the next 2 weeks, the mausoleum was violated 4 more times, and each time, the ritual seemed to become more elaborate. More candles, more complex symbols, strange objects left behind, small animal bones, jars with dark liquids, burned photographs of people I didn't recognize. I installed a security camera pointing directly at the Ortega Mausoleum. If anyone approached, we would capture it on video. The first night with the camera, I reviewed the recording the next morning, and what I saw left me frozen. At 3:17 in the morning, the door of the mausoleum opened, but no one opened it. It simply opened by itself, slowly moving outward. Then, for about 15 minutes, the camera showed only the dark entrance of the mausoleum. No one visible entered or exited. But when I went to physically check the mausoleum that morning, there they were. The candles, the symbols, everything perfectly set up as in previous times. How was that possible? The camera had recorded continuously. No one had entered. And yet, someone or something had performed the ritual. I showed the recording to my supervisor, hoping he might have an explanation. He watched it in silence, his expression growing more serious. "Roberto, I need to tell you something about that mausoleum," he finally said. "Something that few know." He took me to his office and pulled out an old file from a drawer. It contained cemetery documents dating back decades. In 1952, there was an incident at the Ortega Mausoleum. A woman named Iris Vidal was found dead inside. She had performed some kind of suicidal ritual, poisoning herself while surrounded by candles and symbols. She left a note saying that she had made a pact with something she called the guardian of the thresholds, and that her death was just the beginning of that pact. What kind of pact? The note was delirious, full of nonsensical words, but the coherent part said that she would open a path between the world of the living and the dead, that every new moon she would return to complete her work. Obviously, the authorities dismissed it as the ramblings of a mentally ill woman. But what? Every so often over the years, night watchmen have reported strange activity in that mausoleum. Always around the new moon, and always the same pattern. Candles, symbols, ritual objects. Some watchmen quit because of it, others simply stopped reporting it. Why did no one do anything? My supervisor shrugged. What could they do? There's no evidence that anyone is entering. There's no real damage. It's easier to ignore it than to try to explain it. But I couldn't ignore it. Not now that I knew the story, and definitely not after what happened that very night. It was a new moon. I knew something would happen, so I decided to stay awake all night, watching the mausoleum from a safe distance, hidden behind a large tree with a clear view of the entrance. The hours passed slowly. Midnight, 1 in the morning, 2. At 3 in the morning, just as the recording had shown, the door of the mausoleum began to open, slowly, without anyone touching it, as if an invisible hand was pushing it. I forced myself to remain hidden, watching. The mist had grown thicker, swirling around the mausoleum in a way that seemed almost alive. And then I saw her. A figure emerged from the mausoleum. It was a woman, dressed in vintage clothing from the 50s. A dark dress, low-heeled shoes, hair pulled back in a bun. She walked with deliberate steps, as if she were in a trance. She was carrying a bag from which she took out the black candles, the jars, all the implements of the ritual. She meticulously arranged them on the floor of the mausoleum, working with the skill of someone who has done this thousands of times. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This woman seemed solid, real, but she had emerged from a sealed mausoleum, filled with coffins of people who had died decades ago. How was that possible? I took out my cell phone trying to record, but as soon as I pointed the camera at her, the screen filled with static. The phone completely shut down, as if the battery had instantly drained. The woman finished preparing her ritual. She knelt in the center of the triangle of candles and began to sing. I couldn't clearly hear the words from my hiding place, but the sound was unsettling, a monotonous melody in a language I didn't recognize. As I sang, something began to change in the air. The temperature dropped abruptly, my breath became visible, and the mist started to move in ways that normal fog shouldn't move. It swirled, condensed, taking on almost humanoid shapes. There were figures in the fog, dozens of them, spectral shapes materializing at the edges of the cemetery, slowly moving towards the mausoleum, drawn by the woman singing. They were the dead, the spirits of those buried here, and she was summoning them. Terror paralyzed me. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to get out of the cemetery and never return. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching this impossibility unfold before me. The spectral figures surrounded the mausoleum, forming a circle. The woman raised her arms, her singing reaching a crescendo. And then, in the exact center of her triangle of candles, something began to materialize. It was a crack in the air. There is no better way to describe it, as if space itself were tearing, revealing something behind. A darkness deeper than any normal blackness. A darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe. From that crack emerged things. They were neither human nor animal. They were twisted, impossible shapes that hurt to look at directly. Tentacles of shadow, eyes that shone with sickly light, mouths full of teeth that should not exist. The woman spoke with these things in that strange language. She seemed to be negotiating, offering something in exchange for something else. The spirits of the dead watched silently, witnesses to this profane exchange. Then, without warning, the woman turned her head directly towards my hiding place. Our eyes met through the mist and darkness. She shouldn't have been able to see me. I was perfectly concealed, in the shadows, motionless. But she saw me, she smiled. And that smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. It was neither malicious nor cruel. It was empty, emotionless, like the smile of a doll or a mask. He raised a hand, pointing at me. The things that had emerged from the crack turned towards me. The spirits of the dead turned towards me. All at once, they began to move in my direction. That was the moment my paralysis broke. I ran faster than I had run in years, stumbling over roots and gravestones, not caring about the direction as long as it was away from that mausoleum and the things coming towards me. I could feel them behind me. I didn't hear footsteps, but a collective whisper, like 1,000 voices speaking at the same time. The air around me turned icy. My lungs burned with every breath. I reached the guard booth, threw myself inside and locked the door. The booth's windows had metal bars, installed years ago for protection against vandals. I had never been so grateful for those bars. Things arrived moments later. I saw them pressing against the windows, dark and twisted shapes blocking the street light. The spirits of the dead floated around the booth, their spectral faces looking inward with expressions of pleading or warning. It was hard to tell, and among them, walking calmly toward the booth's door, was the woman. Iris Vidal, the one who had died in 1952, the one who had made a pact with something dark and had promised to return every new moon. He stopped in front of the door. Through the reinforced glass, he could see her clearly. Her skin was pale, almost transparent. Her eyes were black, completely black, with no visible white. And when she spoke, her voice penetrated through the door as if there were no barrier. "Watcher," she said. Her voice was multiple, as if many people were speaking simultaneously. "You have seen what you should not have seen. You have interrupted the sacred work." "I didn't want to. I'm just doing my job," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Your job is to watch over the dead, but you do not understand what that really means. The dead do not rest peacefully in their graves. They are trapped, prisoners between worlds, suffering in silence. I offer them release. I open the door so they can finally cross." "Where do they cross to?" Her smile widened. "To where we all must eventually go. To the other side of the veil. To the realm of the guardian of the thresholds." "And those things?" The monsters that came with you. They are not monsters. They are the guardians of the path. They ensure that only the truly dead can cross. The living must remain here unless they voluntarily choose to make the journey. Are you offering me a choice? Everyone has a choice, Watcher. You can forget what you saw tonight. You can go on with your life, ignorant of the deeper truths. Or you can join me in my work. You can help free the trapped dead. You can serve the guardian. And what if I refuse both options? The smile vanished from her face. Then you will become a problem that must be resolved. The things in the windows began to press harder. The glass creaked under the pressure. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I have until dawn to decide, I said, trying to buy time. Iris Vidal tilted her head, considering. Until dawn then, but choose wisely, Watcher. Your soul is at stake. She and the things withdrew, fading into the mist. The spirits of the dead lingered a moment longer, looking at me with what seemed to be pity, before also disappearing. I stayed in the guardhouse, trembling, waiting for dawn. It was the longest wait of my life. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to be them returning. When the sun finally rose, the first light of day swept over the cemetery. Everything seemed normal again, calm, peaceful, as if the nightmare of the previous night had never happened. But when I went to the Ortega mausoleum, I found evidence that it had indeed occurred. The candles were there, burned down to the stubs. The symbols were drawn, and in the center of the triangle, there was a message written in ash. Until the next new moon, choose. I quit that very morning. I told my supervisor that I had health issues, that I needed a less stressful job. He didn't ask questions. I think he knew. But resigning did not end my problems. Because every new moon since then, no matter where I am, I feel its presence. Sometimes I see it in the corners of my vision, watching me from the shadows, reminding me that I still haven't made my choice. I have researched everything I can about Iris Vidal. She was an ordinary woman before her death. She worked as a secretary, lived alone, and had no family. The police records of her death mention that she had been studying occult texts in the months leading up to her suicide, particularly about something called the Guardians of the Thresholds, entities supposedly responsible for guiding souls between life and death. I found her grave in the cemetery. It is in the oldest section, a simple headstone with just her name and dates. I left flowers there. I'm not sure why. Maybe I thought that if I showed respect, she would leave me in peace. It didn't work. The last new moon, 3 days ago, she appeared in my apartment. She didn't break the door or the window. She was just there when I woke up at 3 in the morning, sitting in the chair next to my bed. "The time is running out, Roberto," she said, using my name for the first time. "You have avoided the decision for 6 months, but you can't avoid it forever. On the next new moon, you either join me, or I take your soul anyway. Those are your only options now." Why me? Why not just continue your ritual and leave me alone? Because you saw. Because you know. I can't allow that knowledge to exist without consequence. Either you become part of the work, or you become part of the payment. She disappeared after that, leaving me alone in the darkness, my heart pounding wildly. I have considered going to the police, to the church, to anyone who can help. But what would I tell them? That I am being haunted by the ghost of a woman who died in 1952? That every new moon opens a door between worlds in a cemetery in Montevideo? They would lock me up in a psychiatric hospital. I have considered fleeing, moving to another city, another country, but I know it would be of no use. Iris Vidal has waited more than 70 years to fulfill her pact. She is not going to let something as simple as distance stop her. So here I am, sharing this story, waiting for the next new moon that arrives in 5 days. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know if there is really a choice, or if my fate was sealed the night I decided to hide and observe instead of fleeing. Part of me, a small dark part, is curious. What is really on the other side of the veil? Is it worse than this life of constant fear? Do the dead really suffer in their graves as Iris claims, or is it just a justification for her dark pact? But most of me is terrified. I don't want to die. I don't want to serve incomprehensible entities. I just want all of this to end, to be able to return to a normal life where the only thing I had to worry about was catching vandals and securing doors. I have started carrying protection symbols with me. A crucifix that belonged to my grandmother, salt in my pockets, An amulet I bought from a seller of esoteric items who probably thinks I'm a lunatic. I don't know if they do any good, but they make me feel slightly less vulnerable. I have also been documenting everything. I have written down every detail of my encounters with Iris Vidal. I have drawn the symbols she uses in her rituals. I have recorded the exact dates of each new moon. If something happens to me, at least there will be a record. And now, sharing this here, there is a public testimony. Maybe that offers some protection. Or maybe it just serves as my final confession before the next new moon arrives and I have to face my choice. I don't know what I will do when that moment arrives. I don't know if I will have the courage to refuse and face the consequences, or if my survival instinct will lead me to accept their offer and become part of something dark and unnatural. The only thing I know for sure is that in 5 days, when the moon disappears from the sky again, I will discover my answer. And whatever my decision may be, my life as I knew it has already ended. There is no turning back from what I have seen, from what I know. The dead do not rest in peace. There are doors between worlds that some open, and watching over a cemetery means much more than just protecting graves from vandals. It means being on the edge of realities that most people will never know. I wish I had remained ignorant. I wish I had never investigated those candles in the Ortega mausoleum. I wish I had quit the first night something seemed strange to me. But I didn't. And now I live with the consequences of my curiosity. That is the story that Roberto sent me. He contacted me 3 days ago, just before the new moon he mentions. I haven't heard from him since then. I've tried calling him, writing to him, but he doesn't respond. I don't know if he made his choice, or if the choice was made for him. If anyone knows the San Miguel Municipal Cemetery in Montevideo, or if you have worked there, let me know in the comments. Maybe someone else knows what happened to Roberto. Take care, and rest easy tonight. A follower who signs as Esteban sent me this story a few days ago. He told me that he had never shared it in detail with anyone, that he tried to do so once with a close friend, and that the look he received was enough to keep him silent for years. So he wrote it to me. If you also have something kept inside that you never knew how to tell, the comments are there, and I read everything that comes in. Now let me tell you what happened to Esteban 4 years ago when he accepted a night watchman job in a building that had been abandoned for over a decade and discovered that he was not the only one taking care of it. I accepted the job because I needed the money. It's that simple. No mystery, no premonition, none of those signs that people say they ignored when telling their horror stories. I didn't ignore any signs because there were no signs. There was only a bank account in the red and an online ad offering weekly cash payment for night watch in a building undergoing legal restructuring. Nothing more. A man called me who introduced himself as the provisional administrator. He spoke quickly with that efficiency of someone who makes the same call 20 times a day. He explained that the building was owned by a company that was in the middle of a legal process, that it could not be intervened or modified until the case was resolved, but it also could not be left unattended because the insurance required it. The job consisted of arriving at 10 at night, making rounds every 2 hours through the 4 floors, noting any novelties in a logbook, and leaving at 6 in the morning when the daytime guard arrived. I asked him how long the building had been abandoned. There was a brief pause. 14 years, he said. I asked him if there was anything I should know before accepting. It's an empty building, he said. All you have to do is make sure it stays empty. I started that same week. The building was in an industrial area of the city that had seen better times. Converted factories, abandoned warehouses, some logistics businesses with their trucks parked during the day and their gates closed at night. At 10 o'clock at night, the sector was dead. The streetlights worked irregularly, 1 yes, 2 no, and the sound of traffic from the main avenue came muffled and distant as if from another world. The building was 5 stories high, although the 5th was closed due to structural damage and I had instructions not to go up there under any circumstances. It was an office building from the 80s, with that gray and functional architecture that was built back then without any aesthetic pretension. Large rectangular windows mostly boarded up with wood or cement blocks. A main entrance with a reinforced glass door, and an interior that smelled exactly like what it was. 14 years of trapped air, accumulated humidity, and the specific dust of places that have forgotten what they are for. On the first day, I explored everything with the flashlight before settling into the small security booth on the ground floor. 4 floors of long, dark hallways, empty offices with traces of what they had been, loose cables from the ceiling, yellow papers on the floor, a forgotten chair, a filing cabinet with open and empty drawers. The kind of place that produces a particular melancholy. Not exactly fear, but something more akin to the sadness of seeing what remains when people leave. The first week was completely normal. I made my rounds, noted no news in the logbook, drank the thermos coffee I brought from home, and spent the dead hours listening to a podcast through my headphones. Boring, silent. Exactly what a night watch job in an empty building should be. It was in the second week when the sounds started. I heard them for the first time on a Wednesday around 1 in the morning. I was making my rounds on the second floor when I noticed it. Footsteps. Not above me, not below, but at the same level, somewhere in the hallway in front of me or behind. It was hard to determine with the strange acoustics of that long, empty corridor. I stopped. I turned off the flashlight. I listened. Silence. I turned it back on, continued my rounds, checked all the offices on the floor. Empty. No signs of forced entry, no open windows, nothing. I convinced myself it had been the building settling. Those sounds that old structures make with the night temperature changes. I noted it in the log anyway. Sounds on the second floor, 01:10 a.m., no apparent cause. The next night I heard it again, this time on the third floor. And this time it wasn't exactly footsteps, but something different. A sound of rubbing, as if something heavy was sliding very slowly over the concrete floor. It lasted a few seconds and then stopped. I checked the entire floor. Nothing. But there was something that hadn't been there the night before. In the central hallway of the third floor, in front of what had been a meeting room, there was a mark in the dust on the floor. A sort of arc, as if someone had opened a door that brushed against the floor while moving. But the door to that room was closed, and when I opened it, the dust inside was perfectly intact, without footprints, without marks. The arc mark was on the hallway side, as if the door had opened outward, from the inside. I mentioned the sounds to the manager when he called that week to confirm the payment. I carefully described the marks in the dust, being as objective as possible, because I was naturally skeptical and didn't want to sound like someone who gets scared of their own shadow. He listened in silence. "Old buildings make noises," he finally said. "If you see something concrete, people, damage, forced entry, call me immediately. Otherwise, continue with your routine." "Has anyone else reported similar things?" I asked. "The previous guards." Another pause. "There has been turnover," he said. "Night work is not for everyone." And he hung up the call. That night I searched for the name of the building on the internet. It took me a while to find something concrete because I didn't know the name of the owning company, but I finally found an article from a local newspaper from 8 years ago that mentioned the building in the context of the legal proceedings. It was a brief note, one of those that newspapers publish on inside pages without giving them too much importance. The owning company was being investigated for accounting irregularities. The building had been its main headquarters, but there was a line at the end of the article that made me stop. It said that the building had been hastily evacuated in 2009, and that several employees had reported events of an unusual nature in the months leading up to the closure. The journalist did not specify what kind of events, just that phrase, and then the note continued with the legal details of the case. I saved the article. I didn't sleep well that afternoon before going to work. In the third week, things escalated. The sounds were nocturnal and consistent, always between 1 and 3 in the morning, always on different floors, as if something was moving from one floor to another following a pattern I couldn't anticipate. I had gotten used to hearing them, which in itself was something that worried me, that quick adaptation to the absurd that the human brain makes when it has no other option. But one night I heard something different. It was a voice, or something like a voice. Not articulated words, but a sound that had the cadence of speech without having its content, like hearing someone speak in another language from very far away, where you can recognize that it is language but cannot decipher anything. It was coming from the 4th floor. I went up. I know I probably shouldn't have done it. I know the sensible option was to call the administrator or just wait until the sound stopped. But there was something about that sound that felt urgent in a way that was hard to rationalize. Not exactly threatening, more like something that needed to be attended to. The fourth floor was darker than the previous ones because 2 out of every 3 windows were completely sealed with concrete blocks. My flashlight was the only point of light in a hallway that stretched about 40 meters in front of me, with doors on both sides, most open, some closed. The sound was coming from the back. I walked slowly. The dust muffled my steps but did not eliminate them, and in the silence of the building, every sound I made seemed to amplify. I reached the end of the hallway. There was a closed door, different from the others because it had a metal plate where there should have been a number or a name, and the plate was blank, as if someone had installed it with the intention of putting something there and never did. The sound was coming from behind that door. I stopped in front of it. I placed my hand on the wooden surface and felt it cold, much colder than it should have been considering the temperature of the hallway. The sound continued, that cadence of speech without words, and while I stood there with my hand on the door, something happened that took me completely by surprise. The sound stopped, and in the silence that followed from the other side of the door, someone knocked from inside. 3 knocks. Slow, precise, like someone waiting to be let in. I withdrew my hand. I stepped back 3 paces. I stood absolutely still for what must have been a whole minute, although it felt much longer. No one knocked again. I went down to the first floor, sat in the booth, and did not make the round at 3 in the morning. The following night, I arrived at the building with the intention of opening that door. I had spent the day pondering the matter with the cold logic one achieves when there is sunlight outside and a hot coffee in hand. Someone had entered the building. That was the most reasonable explanation. A homeless person, someone seeking shelter, someone who had found a way in that I had not detected. The 3 knocks on the door were simply someone who had heard my footsteps and reacted in what seemed the most logical way to them. I went straight up to the 4th floor. The hallway was the same as always. I reached the back door, the one with the blank plate, and turned the knob. It was locked. I checked the rest of the floor. Nothing. No open windows, no signs of human presence. I went down and checked the other floors. The same. Everything sealed, everything empty, everything exactly as it should be. I returned to the 4th floor, to that door. I stood in front of it for a good while, staring at the blank metal plate, and it was then that I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before because I was too agitated to pay attention to details. Beneath the door, on the hallway floor, there was a thin line of something dark. Dust, I thought at first, but I crouched down and looked closely with the flashlight, and it wasn't dust. It was a granular substance, laid out in a perfectly continuous line along the entire threshold of the door without any interruption. Salt. Someone had put salt on the threshold of that door, and by the way it was laid out, from the inside, not from the hallway. I found the daytime guard one morning when I left late due to a delay with the logbook. His name was Hernan, a man in his 50s with a face that looked like he had seen too many things to be surprised by anything. We crossed paths at the entrance, and I exchanged a few words with him, first about work. Then, when I felt he was someone who wouldn't look at me oddly, I asked him about the door on the 4th floor. Hernan looked at me. "Which door?" he said. Although by the way he said it, I knew he knew exactly which door. "The one at the end of the hallway, with the blank metal plate." He nodded slowly, looking away. "I don't go up to the 4th floor," he said. "Why?" He took a while to respond. "Because on the first day I worked here, I went up to the 4th floor, and something clearly told me not to go back." He looked at me. "I've been in this building for 3 years. I haven't gone back up." I asked him what he had seen. "I saw nothing," he said. "That's what I'm telling you. I saw nothing, but something spoke to me, not with words. Here." He touched the center of his chest. "And what it said was not to go up, so I won't go up." He said goodbye and entered the building. I stayed on the sidewalk for a moment, with the keys in my hand and the morning sun warming the street, thinking about the line of salt on the threshold of that door, wondering who had placed it and from which side and when. In the 4th week, I made a decision. I was going to open that door, not out of bravery, not exactly out of curiosity, but because I had spent weeks listening and observing and jotting things down in a logbook that no one read. And at some point that accumulation of small, inexplicable events had reached a critical mass that made it impossible for me to continue functioning normally without seeking an answer. I needed to know what was behind that door. The problem was the key. The keychain they had given me when I started the job had the keys to the main entrance, the security booth, and the floors 1 to 4 in general. But the lock on that specific door was different from the others, older, and none of my keys fit it. I searched in the security booth, which had a drawer with various materials. I found a spare flashlight, batteries, a roll of adhesive tape, and at the bottom of the drawer, underneath an operations manual for the building dated 2007, I found a key. It was older than the others, made of dark metal, unlabeled, with no indication of what it opened. I took it. I went up to the 4th floor. It fit perfectly. The room behind the door was different from all the other offices in the building. Not in size. It was similar to the others, rectangular, with a sealed window in the exterior wall. But while the other offices were completely empty, this one had things. A table in the center, 4 chairs around it, and on the table, arranged with a precision that was clearly not accidental, a set of objects that took me a moment to process. Candles. Extinguished. Burned down to the middle, fixed with their own melted wax on the surface of the table. 7 in total, arranged in a pattern that I did not recognize but clearly had an internal logic. Between the candles, on the dark wood of the table, there were marks traced with something, not painted but engraved. Lines and curves that formed a complex design and that the dust accumulated on the table suggested had been there for a long time. And in the exact center of the design, between the candles, there was a photograph. I took it carefully. It was a black and white photo, the kind taken with an analog camera, showing a group of people standing in front of the building. The building was immediately recognizable by its characteristic facade. There were 6 people, dressed in office attire, looking at the camera with that slightly serious expression typical of formal photos. On the back, someone had handwritten a date, March 2008, a year before the hasty eviction. I was looking at the photo when I felt it. I didn't see him. I didn't hear anything. I simply felt with a certainty that had no rational explanation that there was someone else in the room. I looked up. There was no one. But the air had changed. It had acquired that particular density that I already knew from the 3rd floor, from the hallway, from the nights when the sounds were clearer. And the temperature had dropped noticeably, not gradually but suddenly, as if someone had opened a window in winter, except that the window was sealed and the outside temperature was that of a summer night. I turned towards the door. It was still open. The hallway on the other side, dark and empty. And then I heard the voice. This time it wasn't that indecipherable cadence of the previous nights. This time there were words, clear, in Spanish, pronounced with a calmness that was more disturbing than any scream. "Close the door," said the voice. There was no one who could have said it. Not in that room, not in the hallway I could see. The voice had come from no specific place and from everywhere at the same time with that quality that sounds have in dreams, omnidirectional and precise simultaneously. I left. I didn't walk. I quickly left that room, slammed the door shut without worrying about whether it made noise, and ran down the 4 floors without looking back. I reached the guardhouse. I turned on all the lights I could. I sat down. I didn't go back up that night. The next day I quit. I called the administrator in the morning, told him I couldn't continue, that I had other commitments. He didn't ask too many questions. He told me to come by to pick up the payment for the week and to leave the keys at the booth. Before leaving for good that last night, I did something that I still don't quite understand why I did. I went back to the back room. It was just as I had left it. The candles, the marks on the table, the photograph which I had left face down and found face up again, with the 6 people looking at the camera. I took out my phone and photographed everything. The table, the engraved design, the photograph, the candles. I didn't know why. I just felt I needed to document it before leaving. Then I searched in my backpack. I had a packet of salt that I always carried because I put salt on everything and found it practical to have it on hand. I took it out, and without really knowing why, or maybe knowing but not wanting to analyze it too much, I traced a continuous line with the salt on the threshold of that door, from the hallway to the outside. I locked the door and left the key on the table in the guardhouse when I left that morning. 4 years have passed. I never went back to that building or that neighborhood. I don't know what happened with the legal process. I don't know if the company recovered the building or if it was demolished or if it still stands there with its night watchman listening to sounds on the 4th floor. I didn't want to look it up. There are things that are better left in the past. But I keep the photographs I took that last night. Sometimes I look at them. The design etched on the table, whose lines and curves I searched for online without finding any clear reference. The candles in their pattern of 7, and the black and white photograph with the 6 people in front of the building. A few months ago, looking at that photograph for the umpteenth time, I noticed something that I had somehow ignored all the previous times. Perhaps because I looked at it quickly before, or in low light, or simply because the brain has a way of protecting us from what it is not ready to process. Behind the group of 6 people, visible through the glass of the main entrance of the building, there is one more figure. Inside the building, looking outside. It is not part of the group. It does not have the pose of someone who was just passing by at the moment the photo was taken. It is standing, perfectly centered in the frame of the glass door, looking directly at the camera with an attention that can be perceived even in an old black and white photo. And what disturbs me the most, what has troubled me since that night when I finally saw it, is that the figure does not have the blurriness of something captured in motion, nor the imprecision of someone in the background of a frame. It is perfectly sharp. Sharper, I would say, than any of the 6 people in the foreground, as if it knew exactly that it was being photographed, as if it had posed. That is what happened. That is all I have to tell. That was the end of Esteban's story. He told me that he never found more information about the building, that he stopped searching at some point because the search itself was more disturbing than not knowing. Sometimes that is the most sensible thing to do. If this story made you think of a place you visited that felt wrong in a way you couldn't explain, I would like to know. Leave it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, consider doing so. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Take care tonight. We'll talk soon. I have here the testimony of a listener who signs as Patricia from Bolivia. She wrote to me that what she is about to share happened when she was 51 years old, during a trip she took alone to a town where her family had lived generations ago. She says she went to seek her roots and found something that no one had warned her about. If you have a family story that hides more than it seems, I would love to read it below. Now this is what Patricia discovered. I went to Altamira to seek my dead. Not literally, although with what happened afterward, that phrase takes on a meaning that it did not have at that moment. I went because I had wanted to do it for years, and because at 51, one begins to understand that things that are indefinitely postponed end up never happening. I went because my mother, before she died, had spoken to me several times about that town, with a mix of nostalgia and something harder to name, something like guilt, or the relief of someone who left something behind and is not completely sure it was right to leave it. Altamira was the town where my maternal grandmother was born, and my grandmother's mother, and that mother's mother. A line of women who had lived in that place for generations until my grandmother left it at 20 with my grandfather and never returned. Never. In 50 years of adult life, my grandmother did not go back to Altamira even once. When we asked her why, she said there was nothing to see anymore, that everything that had been that place for her was left in the past, and that the past was better left undisturbed. I never understood that, until I went. Altamira was about 6 hours from the city where I live, by road. It was a medium-sized town by the standards of the region, with a central square, a colonial church, and a market on Sundays. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon in my own car, with a reservation at a small inn I had found online that had 3 stars and photographs showing clean rooms and a courtyard with flowers. What the photographs did not show was what I felt upon entering the town. It was nothing concrete. There was no visible sign, no sound, no particular smell. It was simply a feeling that the air changed upon crossing the boundary of the town. It became denser, quieter, like the air in a closed space that has been that way for a long time. And with that, a very slight discomfort that I attributed to the fatigue of the journey and the weight of being in a place that carried all the meaning I had given it before knowing it. I settled into the inn. The lady who managed it was named Doña Inés, a woman of about 65 years with her hair tied up and working hands. She asked me for my last name for the register, as is customary, and when I said it, she looked at me in a way that lasted barely a second but that I noticed. "Family from here?" she asked. "On my mother's side," I said. "My grandmother was from Altamira. She was born here." Doña Inez nodded and continued with the registration without saying anything else. That night I had dinner at a restaurant in the square and went to bed early. In the morning I planned to go to the civil registry to look for documents about my ancestors, and to the cemetery to find the graves of those who had lived in that town before me. I slept well that first night. No dreams, or at least none that I remembered upon waking. The civil registry opened at 9. The official who attended to me, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, searched the system for my grandmother's last name and then in the physical files, which for the older years were still on paper and not digital. He found records, several, spanning multiple generations. Births, marriages, deaths. I documented everything in a notebook, that chain of names and dates that builds the history of a family in a way that no family conversation ever fully captures. It was in one of those documents that I found the first thing I didn't expect. The death record of a woman who had died 120 years ago, my grandmother's grandmother, according to the chain I was reconstructing. The cause of death was noted in the formal handwriting of the records from that time. The official helped me read it because the paper was deteriorated and the writing was difficult. The cause of death noted was consumption by pact. I stared at that phrase. What does that mean? I asked the official. She read the document again, frowning. I don't know, she said. It's a rare notation. Normally at that time they would write disease, accident. This is unusual. I photographed the document and continued reviewing. In the cemetery that afternoon, I found the graves without much difficulty. They were in the oldest section, with stone tombstones that time had partially covered with lichen, and that had that appearance of things that have been waiting a long time for someone to visit them. I kept photographing them, reading the names, connecting the dates with what I had found in the civil registry. It was a quiet and somewhat emotional task. These were my dead, people I had not known but who were part of who I was. I arrived at the oldest grave I found with my last name, that of the woman whose death record said consumption by pact. The tombstone was simple, just the name and the dates, but it had something engraved underneath that the others didn't have. A small symbol at the bottom edge of the stone, partially covered by lichen. I carefully cleaned it with a damp cloth. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, with curved edges and lines that crossed in a way that wasn't decorative. It had the quality of symbols that mean something specific to those who know them and mean nothing to those who don't. I photographed it too. That night at the inn, reviewing the photos on my phone, I showed the symbol to Mrs. Inez, who was at the reception when I passed by. She looked at the photo for a moment. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In a grave in the cemetery, my family." Mrs. Inez returned the phone to me. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "I was thinking of staying until Sunday," I said. She nodded slowly. "There is a woman in the village," she said. "Her name is Doña Remedios. She lives on the street that goes down to the river, the second house with a green gate. She knows about these things. If you want to understand what you found, go see her tomorrow." "What kind of things does she know?" "The ones from here," said Doña Inez. "The ones from this town in particular. I went to see Doña Remedios the next morning. She was an older woman who seemed to be older than she probably was, with that appearance that people sometimes have when they have carried heavy things for a long time. Her house was small and tidy and smelled of herbs I couldn't identify. She let me in without asking who I was or what I wanted, as if she were expecting me. I showed her the photo of the symbol on the tomb. Doña Remedios looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "What is your last name?" she asked. I told her. She nodded, with the expression of someone confirming something they already suspected. "Your family has a history in this town," she said. "Not all of it, but an important part. Do you know anything about it?" "Only that my grandmother left 50 years ago and never returned." "Your grandmother left because she knew," said Doña Remedios. "Or at least she suspected. The women in her family always knew, one way or another. The problem is that knowing is not enough to break what is done." "What is done?" Doña Remedios got up and went to a cupboard from which she took out a thick book with leather covers, which she placed on the table between the two of them. 140 years ago, he said, a woman from her family made a deal. I don't know the exact details. No one knows them entirely, but the outcome is documentable. From that deal, the female line of that family had certain things: prosperity, health. The daughters were born well, grew up well, lived well, for several generations. And the price? The price was that something would have the right to be close. Not inside, not controlling. Close. Observing. And every certain number of generations, claiming one. He fell silent for a moment. Your grandmother's grandmother was the first to pay, he continued. That's the one that says consumption by pact in the record. She died young, and in a way that the doctors of that time could not explain. After her, there were others, not always deaths. Sometimes it was something different, one that got lost, one that went mad, one that disappeared without explanation. The chain continues. Did my grandmother know? Her grandmother knew that if she stayed in Altamira, where the bond is anchored, the proximity was greater. That distancing does not break the bond but weakens it. Doña Remedios looked directly at me. You came here, voluntarily, and you brought your surname with you. The silence that followed was heavy. What does that mean? I asked. That what is anchored here recognized you when you entered the town, she said. That now it knows you exist and where you are. And what do I do? Doña Remedios opened the thick book and searched through its pages until she reached a section marked with a piece of cloth. There is a way to notify oneself, she said. Not to break, as that would require things that are no longer available, but to establish that you came voluntarily, that you honored the debt with your presence, and that you can leave. Sometimes that is enough for the cycle not to advance upon you. Sometimes. I have no certainties, she said. Just experience. We did what Doña Remedios indicated that afternoon. We returned to the cemetery, to the grave with the symbol. Doña Remedios brought things that I will not describe in detail because she asked me not to. What I can say is that something was said aloud directed at the stone, and that I repeated certain words when she indicated me to, and that at some point during that process, the temperature in that section of the cemetery dropped in a way that did not correspond to the wind or the shadow of any tree, and then it rose again, gradually, until it was the normal temperature of an October afternoon. Doña Remedios said it was enough. I stayed that night longer and left the next day, a Saturday, a day earlier than planned. On the way back, halfway through the route, I stopped to get gas. While I waited, I looked at my phone and found a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It just said, "You can leave now." There was no name. The number, when I tried to look it up later, didn't match any known contact. And when I tried to call it, the tone was of a non-existent line. I never found out who that message was from. I didn't ask either. I got home that night and called a cousin, the only relative from that line I have left, and I told her what I had found. Not everything, but enough. I told her I had information about the family, documents, photographs, that whenever she wanted, we could talk. My cousin listened in silence and finally said, "My mother always said that we shouldn't go to that town. And did you know why?" "Not exactly," she said. "But there are things you learn not to ask about. I keep thinking about that, about how much the women in my family knew that chose not to say anything, about whether the silence was a protection or if it was the silence that allowed the story to keep repeating itself without anyone interrupting it. I have no answer for that. What I do know is that since I returned from Altamira, something has changed. Not in the world outside, but in me. A kind of awareness that certain things exist and that ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. My grandmother knew it. That's why she left. I went, and I think I survived, I believe. This is where Patricia wanted to share. She told me that writing it took her months, that there were parts she didn't know how to put into words. She succeeded. If you have a family history that holds secrets that no one can fully explain, or if you ever went to search for your roots and found more than you expected, tell me in the comments. I love reading those stories. And if you stayed listening until now, subscribe. There are many more testimonies waiting. Rest well. We'll talk soon. Someone who prefers to remain anonymous sent me this experience a few days ago. They work as a paramedic on night shifts, and what they witnessed during an emergency call at an abandoned house has kept them awake since then. If you work in emergency services and have seen something you can't explain, I would really like you to share it in the comments. Now this is the story of a night that forever changed the way this paramedic views their job. I can't give my real name for reasons that will become clear. I have been working as a paramedic in a medium-sized city in Colombia for 8 years. I have seen all kinds of emergencies, car accidents, heart attacks, stab wounds, overdoses. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was completely wrong. What I am about to tell happened 3 months ago, during a Friday night shift. It was 2:30 in the morning when we received the call. A woman's voice, hysterical, screaming that her son was dying, that he needed help immediately. She gave us an address on the outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood I vaguely knew as an old residential area. Large houses of well-off families that had moved in decades ago. My partner that night was Javier, a guy with 20 years of experience who had literally seen it all. We got into the ambulance and headed to the address while the dispatcher tried to get more information from the call. But the line had cut off after giving the address, and when they tried to call the number back, no one answered. "Probably a child with a high fever," Javier commented as he drove through the empty streets. "First-time parents always panic. We arrive, give him something to bring down the temperature, and that's it." We arrived at the address in 15 minutes. The house was at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by tall trees that blocked the light from the street lamps. It was an old 2-story building, Spanish colonial style, with white walls stained by moisture and a completely neglected garden. All the windows were dark. "Are you sure this is the place?" I asked as we got out of the ambulance with our equipment. Javier checked the address on his phone. "It's here, number 247. We approached the front door. I rang the doorbell, but it didn't work. I knocked hard on the door. "Emergency medical services. Please open up." There was no response. I tried turning the doorknob, and to my surprise, it was open. The door creaked open slowly with a prolonged squeak that made my skin crawl. "I don't like this," I murmured. "Me neither," Javier agreed. "But we have an emergency call for a sick child. We can't just leave." We entered with our flashlights on. The interior smelled of dampness, mold, and something sweeter that I couldn't identify. The beam of my flashlight revealed a spacious foyer with furniture covered in dusty white sheets. The walls had damp marks, and the wallpaper was peeling off in long strips. "Hello?" I called. "We are paramedics. Is anyone here?" A sound came from the second floor. Footsteps, slow, dragging, and then a woman's voice, weak and trembling. "Upstairs, please, my son." Javier and I exchanged glances. Something about this felt deeply wrong, but we had a duty to investigate. We carefully climbed the stairs, testing each step before putting our full weight down. The wood creaked ominously. On the second floor there was a long hallway with several doors. One of them, at the end of the hallway, was ajar. A pale light emanated from within, flickering as if it were from candles. We approached cautiously. I pushed the door, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. The room was illuminated with dozens of black candles arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle, on the wooden floor, lay a child of perhaps 8 years. He was completely still, with his eyes closed, dressed in white clothing that looked old-fashioned. His skin was pale, almost gray. Next to the child, kneeling, was a middle-aged woman with long black hair loose over her shoulders. She wore a dark dress and had her hands extended over the child in what seemed to be some kind of ritual. "Ma'am, we are paramedics," I said, quickly approaching. "Please step aside. We need to examine the child." The woman did not move. She didn't even look up. She continued murmuring something softly, words I couldn't understand. Javier moved to the other side of the circle. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside now. Your son needs medical attention." When the woman finally lifted her head to look at us, I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were completely black with no visible white, and when he spoke, his voice sounded strange, as if several people were speaking at the same time. "They can't stop it. It's already done. The pact is sealed." "What pact?" I asked, but Javier was already crossing the circle of candles to reach the boy. The moment Javier stepped inside the circle, all the candles went out simultaneously. Darkness fell over the room like a heavy blanket. My flashlight flickered and went out. Javier's did too. "What the hell?" I heard Javier curse in the darkness. I took out my phone to use its light, but the screen was completely black even though it had been fully charged moments before. In that absolute darkness, I heard the woman laugh. It wasn't normal laughter. It was high-pitched, hysterical, and definitely not coming from a single throat. Then the candles reignited on their own, all at once with flames burning twice as high as before, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The woman was no longer kneeling. She was standing, and there was something deeply wrong with the way her body moved, as if her joints weren't functioning properly. She turned towards us, and I saw that her skin had taken on a sickly grayish hue. Black smoke was coming from her open mouth. "He promised me power," she said with that multiple voice. "Power over life and death. All I asked for was the soul of my son. A fair exchange." "Ma'am, you're delirious." I tried to use my calmest tone, even though my heart was racing wildly. "He needs psychiatric help. We're going to take the child and then we'll talk about getting him help too." Javier was already with the child, checking his vital signs. "He has no pulse," he said urgently. "And he's cold, very cold. We need to start CPR now." But when Javier tried to move the child out of the circle, something stopped him. It was as if there was an invisible barrier. The child's body simply wouldn't move beyond the edge of the circle of candles, as if it were bound by invisible strings. "He's trapped," the woman murmured, smiling with a grotesque expression. "His soul is no longer in his body. It's in the hands of my master, and soon I too will be free from this mortal flesh, free to serve in the realm of shadows." At that moment, the child's body convulsed. His eyes snapped open, but they were not the eyes of a child. They were black like the woman's, empty of everything except darkness. His mouth opened, and from it came a voice that was not childish but deep and resonant. "More souls," said the boy, who was no longer a boy. "We bring more souls. The witnesses are welcome. Join the service." Javier stepped back, his professional training finally overcome by primal terror. "We need to get out of here, now." But when we turned toward the door, it slammed shut. I tried to open it, but it was sealed, as if it had fused with the frame. The windows too, although there was nothing visible blocking them. The room temperature had dropped drastically. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. The candles burned brighter, but their light gave no warmth, only a ghostly illumination that made everything look surreal. The woman began to walk in circles around the child, singing in a language I had never heard. Her voice blended with the voice coming from the child's body, creating a discordant harmony that hurt my ears. On the walls, the shadows began to move in ways that did not correspond with the candlelight. They stretched, twisted, taking shapes that vaguely resembled humans, but were completely wrong. And in those shadows, I could swear I saw faces, dozens of them, all silently screaming. "This is a demonic possession," Javier whispered, his voice trembling. "Either we're having a collective hallucination from carbon monoxide or something worse." "I am a paramedic, not a priest," I replied, trying to maintain some semblance of rationality. "But whatever this is, we need to get out." I tried to break the window with a chair, but the glass wouldn't shatter. It was like hitting solid steel. Javier tried to break down the door, but it was equally futile. The woman's chant grew louder, more frantic. The child's body began to slowly levitate off the ground, rising to hover 1/2 meter in the air, arms outstretched, as if crucified in midair. And then, something began to materialize in the room. At first, it was just a distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. But gradually, it solidified into a shape that my mind struggled to process. It was vaguely humanoid, at least 2.5 meters tall, but its skin was like cracked black coal with red light shining from the fissures. He had twisted horns protruding from his head, and his eyes burned with sickly yellow fire. "The master has arrived," the woman said, kneeling. "I have fulfilled my part of the pact. My son belongs to you. Now give me what you promised." The creature spoke, and its voice resonated not only in the room but inside my head, vibrating in my bones. "The child is mine. But you still have use in this plane. I cannot free you yet." The woman let out a scream of frustration and rage. You promised you would take me with you, that you would make me immortal in your service." "And I will," the creature replied, "but not yet. First, you must bring me more souls. These two will do." It pointed at Javier and me. It was at that moment that Javier did something unexpected. He pulled a small crucifix from his pocket, something I didn't know he had, and held it in front of him with a trembling hand. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave," he said, his voice gaining strength. "You have no power over us." The creature laughed, a sound like stones being crushed. "A symbol? Is that all? Symbols only have the power you give them. And your faith?" It leaned toward Javier, sniffing. "Your faith is weak, doctor, filled with doubts. You don't scare me." But as the creature spoke, I noticed something. When Javier had crossed the circle of candles, he had broken the pattern. One of the candles had tipped over, extinguishing itself. The circle was no longer complete. "Javier," I whispered, "the circle, it's broken."
The ritual is not complete. Javier's eyes widened with understanding. Without thinking twice, he kicked over another candle, then another. The circle broke at multiple points. The creature roared with fury. No! The ceiling! The floating body of the child fell to the ground with a dull thud. The woman screamed, lunging towards us with her hands outstretched like claws. But when she reached the edge of where the circle had been, she stopped abruptly, as if she had hit an invisible wall. The circle contained her too, I realized. She couldn't leave while the ritual was not complete. The creature was fading, its solid form becoming translucent. This is not over, it promised in a fading voice. I have been summoned. Now I know where this place is. I will return, and when I do, all the souls here will be mine.
With a final flash of red light, the creature completely disappeared. The temperature in the room began to normalize. The door, which had been sealed, swung open abruptly. The woman fell to the floor, sobbing. Her eyes had returned to normal, no longer black but common brown. She looked confused, disoriented. What happened? She murmured. Where is my son? Where is Miguel? Javier cautiously approached the child. He checked his pulse, his breathing. He's alive, he said with evident surprise. Weak, but alive. He has a pulse and is breathing. We loaded the child onto a stretcher and helped the woman walk. She was in shock, seeming to remember nothing of the ritual or the creature. She kept asking what had happened, why she was in that abandoned house, how she had gotten there. When we left the house, the cool night air had never felt so welcome. We loaded both the woman and the child into the ambulance. During the ride to the hospital, the child briefly regained consciousness. He looked at me with clear, normal, childlike eyes. I was in a dark place, he whispered. There was something there that wanted to stay with me. But you took me out. Thank you. At the hospital, both the child and the woman were admitted for observation. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with them except dehydration and low blood sugar levels. The psychiatric evaluation determined that the woman had experienced some type of psychotic episode, possibly drug-induced, although the blood tests came back clean. The official story was that a woman with mental health issues had taken her child to an abandoned house during a psychotic episode and that we had found and rescued them. Simple, neat, rational, but Javier and I knew the truth. We had seen something that had no rational explanation, something ancient and malevolent that existed on the fringes of reality, waiting to be invoked by those desperate or crazy enough to try. We reported the incident as we experienced it to the on-duty coordinator that night, but they looked at us as if we were delirious. They conducted toxicology tests to ensure we had not been under the influence of substances. The tests came back clean. Work stress was the official diagnosis. Shared hallucination induced by exhaustion and the unsettling atmosphere of the abandoned house. They gave us a week of mandatory rest and recommended sessions with the department's psychologist. But I know what I saw. Javier does too. We have talked about it privately, away from official ears. We both saw the same thing. We both felt the same thing. And we both know that what we encountered that night was real. I have researched the house since then. It turns out it has a dark history. It was owned by a wealthy family in the 60s. The patriarch, a man named Augusto Restrepo, was obsessed with the occult. He performed rituals in that house, invoked entities, sought power over death. In 1968, the entire family died under mysterious circumstances. The bodies were found in that same room on the second floor, arranged in a circle with black candles around. The investigation concluded that it was a murder-suicide, but it was never determined what motivated Augusto to kill his entire family and then himself. The house has been abandoned since then. Several subsequent owners tried to live there, but all reported strange phenomena and quickly moved out. Eventually, it was completely abandoned. I don't know how that woman and her son ended up there that night. When she regained lucidity, she didn't remember going to that house. Her last clear memory was being in her apartment, reading a story to her son before bed. Then, a void. And after that, waking up in the ambulance with us. The child doesn't remember much either. Just fragments of dark dreams, whispering voices, and a feeling of intense cold. Javier carries the crucifix with him all the time now. He wasn't particularly religious before, but something about that experience changed his perspective. He goes to Mass every Sunday, something he had never done before. I have started to research more about the occult, not because I want to practice it,
but because I want to understand. I want to know what we saw, what kind of entity it was, and above all, I want to know if what it said is true, that it would return. Because that is the part that keeps me awake at night. The creature said it had been summoned, that it now knew where that place was, and that it would come back. When? And for what purpose? I have driven down that street several times since then, always during the day, never alone. The house is still there, abandoned, dark. Sometimes I swear I see movement in the windows of the second floor, shadows that shouldn't be there in an empty house. The city has condemned the property now. There are plans to finally demolish it, after decades of abandonment. Part of me hopes that this will help, that destroying the physical structure will also destroy any portal or connection that exists there. But another part of me, the part that saw what I saw, knows it won't be that simple. What Augusto Restrepo invoked in the 60s, what that woman touched again 3 months ago, is not tied to bricks and wood. It is something more fundamental, more ancient. It exists in the spaces between light and darkness, waiting to be called by those who seek power, knowledge, or escape from their mortality. And there will always be desperate people, arrogant people, or simply curious people who cross the lines that should not be crossed. I continue to work as a paramedic. It's the only thing I know how to do, the only thing I'm good at. But now I carry protection with me, blessed salt in small packets, holy water in a bottle, and yes, my own crucifix. Maybe they are of no use. Maybe Javier's faith was what really made the difference that night. But they make me feel slightly safer on night calls. Because now I know that not all emergencies we respond to are medical. Some are spiritual. Some are battles in a war that most people don't know is being fought, between forces that existed long before us and will continue to exist long after. And sometimes, in the normal course of our work, we stumble upon those battles, and we have to decide in that moment whether to flee or to face. That night, Javier and I faced, and we survived. But I don't know if we will be so lucky next time, because I feel, on some deep level, that there will be a next time. That creature, that demon, or whatever it was, saw us. It knows us. And the last words it said will resonate in my mind for the rest of my life. I will return. And when I do, all the souls here will be mine. I don't know when that moment will be, but I will be ready, or at least, as ready as a simple paramedic can be against forces that defy all logic and reason. That's all this paramedic wanted to share. He told me that writing this was almost cathartic, a way to process the trauma of that night. The house was demolished last month, but he still has nightmares about what he saw. If you work in emergency services and have encountered something inexplicable, I would love to hear your story in the comments. Sometimes those who respond to calls for help find more than they expected. Sleep well tonight.